everyone. Welcome to another Conversations with series for the EEA. Today, we're talking to Jerome Santoul, an amazing economist at Lancaster University. He's also the recipient of the Exceptional Teaching Award. Thank you for joining us today, Jerome. It's great to have
Well,
you.
well, thanks for having me in. Pleasure to share good practices with fellow members of the economic community. All
So,
right.
firstly, tell us a bit about yourself. What sparked your passion for economics? How did your research interest develop? And maybe an extra question just for fun. If you weren't an
Uh-huh.
economist, what would you be?
Oh, okay. That is actually a big question. So if I weren't an economist, what would I be? An engineer. Because you've probably guessed it from my name, I'm French. In French, the selection of elites is not done through PPE. It's mostly done through engineering studies. So had I not made this choice of doing some kind of weird, there's no equivalent in English. I think it'd be a double major, basically. I'd be an engineer through and through. But at the end of high school, well, I think looking at it back after many years, I made the most important choice of my life, which is I had the choice of going through the classic road of engineering studies or do some weird dual degree in physics and political science. If you're asking what the hell, I wanted to be a politician and work on climate change policies. After a year, I've realized there's a reason why all of the politicians are corrupt, because if you're not willing to debase yourself, you have low probabilities of being elected. And I'm like, I have a bit of integrity and I value it. And that's the time where I discovered economics. Now, at the time, I pursued economic studies and I did a master's. And well, I wanted at the time to work like be a bread and butter consultant. But, and this goes back to your question of like what sparked the interest. I had an excellent professor back in the days who's now at Dauphine, Siddhartha Gordon, Dr. Siddhartha Gordon, who's at Dauphine now in Paris. And he's a game theorist and introduced mechanism design to the field. And one of the paper he presented was like the kidney exchange paper. I don't know if you heard about this one. All right, so the idea is that in the medical science, they face a major conundrum because some people have kidney failures. Now, you can survive without kidneys by being plugged to a machine for long hours. The problem is, I'm overly simplifying. Some people will scream at me in the comments, but basically the machine just buys you time. It will not cure you and it slowly kills you. Your one way out is to get a kidney transplant. The problem is not everybody can give one of their two kidneys to everybody. You have compatibility issues. And what happens is that a lot of people have, for example, someone is in dire need of a kidneys and a parent, an uncle, a brother is willing to chime in and say, I'm willing to give you my kidney. Problem, they're incompatible. And we have many pairs of donors, receivers that are incompatible. And the idea is that some economists use something really well known called the top trading cycle. And the idea is like, maybe if we could like have these people that are incompatible, but then exchange donors, we could suddenly save a lot more people. And it was implemented, I think it started in South Korea, and it spread quite quickly. And now I think every developed country in the world has some kind of kidney exchange program. And this has led to massive benefits. I mean, it's fairly obvious we're saving people. And I was like, wait, we can do this sort of contribution as an economist. How cool is that? And you never hear about this in undergrad, which I think is a big shame. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Then I went looking for a job, didn't quite pan out. And then an opportunity presented itself to me is like, do an integrated PhD, master's plus PhD in Glasgow. I managed to get like a studentship for that, and the rest is history. But if I had to point out the one moment where I was like, okay, economics is actually pretty cool, it'd be this kidney exchange. Do I work in kidney exchange? Absolutely not, but it's still the spark.
I mean, that's quite an inspiring story to get into. Yeah, I was not aware of this, but yeah, really, really cool to find out. What do you think some of the biggest challenges are in economics education today, and what's something that you'd actively do to tackle them?
Okay, if I had to say the biggest challenge throughout all time, I'll tell you this. Somehow, getting people who are not super hard on mathematics to get into mathematics, because we, like in universities, and I think all over the world, we have this problem of economics being the most mathematically inclined social sciences, and yet half of our degrees have no mathematical requirement beyond GCSE in math grade 6, which is pretty basic. So we, on the research level, use math left and right. Our students have a tendency of hating this. How do you bring them in? I would say that has been the challenge for many decades. Now, your question was not the biggest challenge over the decades, but today. And if I say the biggest challenge in economics education today, I'd say something pretty generic, because it's not just economics, it's everywhere, which is a fall in student engagement, left and right, the post-pandemic disengagement, I'd say. So the biggest challenge today is that we have this overall challenge that has been going on for decades of a lot of economics students do not like math, and yet economics is math. And on top of the challenge of bringing them in to get to like the tools of the trade, uh, we have this problem like students have stopped caring. I'm exaggerating, but again, the disengagement. So the two problems are compounding each other. So I'd say that's where we are. Now, what's the challenge? Well, one of the things, and this is the reason why I got the teaching awards, by the way. I've tried to practice something so to get students to come, which is sort of the chaos theory. So this is something I tried for third year module, public policy analysis, basically public economics. And the idea is the convener, Dr. Renaud Foucault, who's an absolutely wholesome person, by the way, has a very interesting exam format that I've never seen anywhere else. And because it's a very unique exam format, half of our tutorials are dedicated to prepare students for that exam. And the way I've managed to get students to come, other than the fact that it's exam prep, is to have them do a bit of group work, but the structure and what we do and the areas in which we focus change every week. And the reasoning was that, yo, if you didn't like what happened this week, because next week is going to be different, you have this incentive of going because maybe next week I'll like it because we're doing something very different, which is what I call the chaos theory, which is sort of a misnomer, but this is this idea of like, because we're changing the exercises we're doing and the overall approach every week, you always have this incentive of like, maybe I like it, or it's new, it's fresh. Instead of like, when you get into this routine of same old, I guess the students were borderline like, what am I doing here? If you keep doing the same thing, they're like, okay, screw that, I'm out. So it worked, but it only worked because this module has 0% math in it. So now the next challenge is, how can you apply such a thing to quantitative stuff?
Have you found any strategies for increasing engagement or attendance for those challenging theoretical topics? And, is there a way that you can introduce this mathematical aspect without students being bored or skipping class?
Okay. I have tried things. Some of them have brought results, but none of them work as well as I'd like them to. So, uh, I mean, reminds me of like a conversation I had with Alvin Bertie, which is like the idea is you can get students interested into math. If you can somehow relate these theoretical concepts to something that is palatable, something that they could touch. Think about an example that I like in an IO module that I teach at Lancaster is this concept of switching costs. Switching costs, okay, you can sort of picture it, but you have a much bigger impact and you can get students much more interested if you start pulling out a nectar card out of your pocket and say, that purple rectangle you have in your wallet or on your phone, if you use the app, is technically a switching cost. Because the way Sainsbury works is you buy stuff in their shops, and depending on the amount of money you spend, you get nectar points. And nectar point can be redeemed to reduce the amount of money you pay for your next purchase. But the thing is, these points are not transferable. It's technically cash, but it's cash that is held and it's only usable in Sainsbury's. And I say, this is switching costs. And the idea is that if you can try to expand that stuff to like, or these sorts of example to more theoretical stuff, like say a choice function. Choice function, you go to a restaurant, I give you a menu. That's the stuff that goes in your choice function, and what you order is the output of your choice function. This thing of like choice function, mathematical objects, very abstract, very nebulous. You going into a restaurant, having a piece of paper in your hand and then ordering stuff, much more relatable. And this is like kind of the approach. But it can only get you so far, I would say, which is why I say it's like, it's not working as well as I would like, because we've got the initial story of introducing the concepts, we've got the model conclusion and like the empirical conclusion, but what I'm still missing and I'm still working on really, really hard is to how you try to weave these narratives throughout solving. When you do an FOC, how do you present this in a palatable way? I hope my gibberish is not too vague, but that's how I'm trying to get this done. And there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Um, so moving on to kind of a hot topic now in education, how do you think generative AI is transforming education today? Do you see any challenges or opportunities with that being integrated?
All right, here's the problem. Uh, this is kind of like how do you say that? It's the secret that nobody should say out loud, but everybody knows, which is there's an incentive for university to pass students that should not really pass, because if you fail too many students, you hurt the bottom line. Right. Now, the main problem generative AI poses is that there's a significant overlap between the essay quality of those marginal fail students or marginal pass students and the quality of output from an AI. And that means, well, it completely ruins the integrity of assessment and accountability. We have tools, there's Turnitin. I've worked on Turnitin as part of some kind of independent research project. And what my early results find is that Turnitin is extremely conservative. That means if Turnitin tells us this is AI, we're fairly confident this is AI. But if Turnitin says it's clean, we could actually be dealing with a very contaminated document. So it's not perfect. So what's the impact? Well, for Lancaster, and as far as I'm concerned, that means I've reduced the amount of take-at-home work completely. And now we're going to move on to presentations in seminars or tutorials and in-person tests. That I would say is the main impact, because, I mean, what hurts more than, say, failing too many students is have our integrity being questioned. And we cannot allow a breach of integrity of our exams. That is definitely not possible. So the impact of Gen AI, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as the department is concerned, we're going to start to move away from take-home exams. That doesn't mean there's no place for AI in education. For example, it can streamline reading research papers a lot, especially because when you're dealing with undergrad students, they don't necessarily have all of the tools to fully grasp like the intricacies of a paper. And this is where I think ChatGPT can come in, because ChatGPT is really good at like pouring through a paper and getting the like big headlines or the big idea. So I guess why not? There are uses. There's also stuff for streamlining. What I encourage students when they have reports to write or their last take-home assessments is like, just if you're afraid of going over the word count limit, just write as much as you can and then ask ChatGPT to squeeze. ChatGPT is good now actually squeezing. That's the one thing I recognize, like it does it well. But yeah, I think that's how we take AI. Now I'm pushing to have vivas as part of examination, but it's more of a pet peeve of mine. But yeah, if we could trade some essays for some vivas, I think that'd be great. And I think employers now, they're not looking for people who can write reports because ChatGPT is going to do it, or DeepSeek, or any Gen AI. But the idea is that they're going to look for analysts who can think quickly and quickly absorb information. And that's what vivas or that sort of stuff, like examinations with very small preparation time, can achieve.
So you mentioned your chaos theory,
Yes.
sort of having a
Well,
fresh thing every week to incentivize students.
yes.
Do you do anything special, or do you have any special techniques in lectures to make it more engaging, or even in seminars as well?
Memes.
Um,
In
the
lecture, memes. The challenge with memes is that you have to use templates that can be understood by people not familiar with internet culture. But I feel like, generally speaking, if you can use a meme template, like an easy to grasp one to capture an economic concept, that's actually pretty fun. And it gives this kind of reprieve of like, you've done a bunch of solving, beam, a meme, and then you can talk behind to explain the conclusions. Nice. Cheap trick, but it works decently, especially if you do it themselves. There's a lot of students like who ask like, where do you find this meme? And I was like, I made it. Usually it's like good to create contact. Yeah,
yeah.
that's one trick. But again, the idea is that if you're teaching stuff that is more qualitative, you have leeway. Quantitative, sadly, it's like, I mean, math is math. At the end of the day, you have to go through the hard stuff. But you can pepper things left and right to just keep people engaged. Kind of the Marvel technique. Well, the full phase 4, but yes.
Do you think there's any underrepresented topics or methods that you believe should be in economics undergrads, or even in
Um,
curriculum further?
do you remember what I told you earlier with like the top trading cycle and kidney exchange? The idea is, I mean, you're an undergrad student, so you're in it. If you look at core microeconomics modules, don't you think it's just being used as a way to give you like the basic building blocks so that you can understand what goes on in macro? It
Yeah.
have that vibe.
Hmm.
It's like, more than half the semester is you do consumer and producer theory, and consumer theory is done in a way it's like, yo, you have a utility function. And when you go to do your groceries, that's what you like. You maximize utility. And I mean, what normal person does an FOC when they do the groceries? Nobody. The reason why we're teaching this, it's because macro models rely on these, and they need to have the basic building blocks. So we as microeconomists are reduced to preparing for macro, and then we have these weeks in which we kind of try to present other topics, but it's either never assessed or has to be treated in such a superficial way that it becomes sort of ridiculous. And I see you nodding, so you have the vibe. Yeah. So now the challenge is like we still need to teach macros, so we still need to have the building blocks. But at the end of the day, earlier this semester, I did a taster lecture on social choice theory, which is basically the branch of economics that studies election systems and their properties. First past the post, runoff, like single non-transferable votes and all of that. And of course, it had to be superficial, but what's good with social choice theory is that there's not a lot of calculus. So you can actually do a taster lecture that can still convey meaningful information. And a lot of people, like, I think it was quite a banger with the audience. And people are like, wait, economists can talk about elections, and they never knew about this. So it's basically, I wouldn't say it's underrepresented topics overall, but in year one, we ought to talk a little more about behavioral stuff, again, social choice theory, health economics, developments, and all of that. Basically, we have electives, but when student picks their electives, they never had an experience with it, so they just go with the title. And I'm like, we ought to introduce these earlier in the curriculum so at least our students can make an informed choice. But again, time constraints. The idea is that there's only so many weeks in the semester. Some of them have to be dedicated, at least on the micro side, to prepare the ground for macro. That usually happens in term 2. And then we have very little time to try to present as many topics as possible, which you see where this is going. But yeah, if it was in my power, I would try to present a little more electives and these sort of sub branches. My research is on sports economics. Nobody hears about, like, when you tell people that you've got a bunch of economists that looks at football, they're like, wait, what? And they usually get interested quickly. Right. So yeah, that'd be the changes I'd see, or the stuff that is underrepresented is like the sub branches of economics.
Do you recommend students engage with current research, maybe if they're even an undergrad, and how do you recommend they do that so they don't get overwhelmed by the methods that you talked about that can be quite difficult to grasp, but also grasp sort of the content of the paper?
Very good question. Very, very good question. Okay. If we're talking about papers, like first year undergrads cannot engage with research. Second year cannot either. Like I would not expect them to like be able to engage because they don't have all of the building blocks. In third year, it depends. I mean, in Lancaster, we are currently in the process of redesigning the entire curriculum. And the idea is one of the innovations that we're going to bring a new third year core module of economics where we are going to deal with papers. So it'll be basically a big reading list with like a lecturer who's usually like an expert in the field of that reading list that's going to introduce the papers, give some informations and all of that. So it will be embedded, but this core is only for the people who are in the BSc econ, not the BA. Now, for one, the public economics module on which I teach, we have attempted to get students to engage with papers. They're usually from the American Economic Review because They're usually applied or experimental because it's more accessible. Theoretical paper are much more arid, I would say, and they're usually from the last decade. So like the 2000s and the 2010s. Well, we had mixed bags with engagement. That is, in previous years, we had students do group presentations of papers. So they had to engage with the things. Did they understand everything? Not quite, because a lot of students do not have the econometric knowledge to fully, to fully capture the subtlety and details behind econometric estimation. So they get some of the points, but they get pretty much overwhelmed. This year, we've tried an approach where it wouldn't be assessed anymore, and I'd have like students would do their readings ahead of time. Well, they were supposed to, and we'd exchange, and I'd consider it a failure because not barely half a quarter of a third of my students actually did their reading ahead of time. So meh. So we're trying new stuff. It'll be for the year 2026, 2027. We'll see how it goes. We're hopeful, especially because we're going to focus on our BSc students. Remains to be seen. So should students engage with research? Well, as long as they're being supervised and railroaded, yes. Otherwise, I think it'll be literally dropping people in the middle of a maze and say, have fun. Not very productive.
How has your teaching style evolved since you first became a lecturer? And do you have any general tips that you'd give new educators or aspiring educators to develop their teaching style?
All right, so how did it evolve? Well, the fundamentals were there and they're still there. The one thing that evolved was like what I nicknamed the chaos theory. Like it took me time to understand it's like trying to change the formula every week to keep things fresh was actually really good. But the fundamentals were still there. My two biggest influences regarding my teaching are a math teacher that I got at the end of high school, who is, shall I say, a very harsh person. Is a math teacher, and the idea is that there was a time where you could ask questions and he would take as long as it need and he would explain as many times that you require a concept. But there was this deadline of once nobody has questions, that means everybody understands that. That means the day after, I could literally assess you on something. So remember, I was 15 at the time. It's like, we're not talking university like environment, and say you were supposed to perform. And this idea of, well, it is your responsibility to ask questions if you don't understand something. And if you don't ask question, I will go with the assumption that you understand and you're expected to perform. That left its mark on me. Because the idea is that many people, well, many students, I mean, you're still young. I remember being young at some point, and we're like, leave me alone. No, I don't have question. I don't understand half of it, but leave me alone. And then the day after, you'd have an assessment. And that was the sort of guy who had no quarrel about failing 3/4 of a class and then putting us in collective detention for a failure to achieve a sufficiently high grade collectively. Yes, I was a really harsh teacher, really, really harsh. Some people hated the guy and considered him a sociopath, which maybe, but it taught a lesson to everybody, which was if you have questions, ask. Because if you don't ask question, you're a grown up. People will make assumptions and don't cry when you do not meet the assumptions. So in a way, it's like putting responsibility through having very clear rule sets, being very patient, But once you say you have it and you nailed it, no mercy. This is the mix between the two of like, you have a job to do, you have program learning outcomes to fulfill. I'm willing to give you my time and my energy so that you can help. But the moment you tell me you're ready, you better be ready. And that's like, it gives you responsibilities. That's the first influence. And I'm trying to adopt this approach of I'm very flexible. You can mail me anytime and I can re-explain you like stuff. But then we have harsh exams because like you ought to perform. If you do not come to see me and you get a bad grade, that's your fault. In a university, students manage their own learning. We ought to practice what we preach. The second influence is a history teacher in the equivalent of a sixth form in France. He's a guy who would basically tell you stories. Like history has story in it. And I like this approach. And economics is great because it's a social science that has math. So I have these two influences in my teaching of we're telling a story, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to do modeling. Those are my two influences. And then over time, the chaos theory came in just to maintain student engagement.
As an ending note, do you have any final advice or anything you'd like to tell our audience?
For
Maybe a trend?
educators, well, there's one thing I would say. Take your topic seriously, but do not take yourself too seriously. At the end of the day, you're a human and you used to be a student. So remember that. Like, economics is serious business, but don't take yourself like to like be able to joke about yourself. Like, you will make mistakes in calculus. Be happy. Do not try to lie and say it was to check if you were following. We all make mistakes. So that would be my stuff. You come out as more natural, I would say, and more relatable like this. And this helps with student engagement.
Wow.
And that's my tip for the day.
Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for joining us today, Jerome. Thank you.
A pleasure.